They never wanted you to know this. Not your teachers, not your government, not the polished anchors on your evening news. Because once you hear it, really hear it, something inside you changes forever. Imagine a family so powerful they could collapse nations with a whisper, finance wars without ever firing a bullet, and manipulate kings as easily as pawns on a chessboard. This is not a myth. This is the story of the hidden empire, a dynasty cloaked in silence and shielded by time. It begins in the cramped, filthy ghettos of Frankfurt, where a man named Mayer Amschel Rothschild wasn't just dreaming of money, he was studying control. Locked out of privilege, he didn't rage. He studied systems, who controlled them, why they worked, and where they broke. Coins became secrets. Antiques became leverage. And slowly, beneath the rot of broken streets and barred opportunity, he planted a seed that would grow into a financial weapon no government could resist. Mayer knew the truth early: land rots, titles fade, but debt? Debt controls empires. And while kings bled in battlefields, he built a fortress, made not of stone, but of favors, interest rates, and secrets whispered in the halls of dying regimes. This isn't a story about money. It's about the architecture of power, the kind that doesn't need a crown to rule. The Rothschilds didn't rise. They designed the rise of markets, of wars, of nations. And while history books fed you fairy tales about revolutions and democracy, the hidden empire kept tightening its grip, not with swords, but with signatures. Ask yourself, why were their names always just beneath the surface? Why does the world know Rockefeller, but whisper Rothschild like a curse? It's because true power doesn't need the spotlight, it thrives in silence, buried beneath distractions, smiling through proxies. And now, you're about to see what they never meant for you to see. Keep watching, because this descent doesn't end in history, it ends in your perception of reality itself. London, 1815. The air smells of smoke, sweat, and fear. Europe holds its breath, Napoleon is losing, the Battle of Waterloo is raging, and no one knows who will inherit the ruins of a continent. But in a quiet corner of London, behind closed doors and a cold stare, Nathan Rothschild already knows. Not because he's clairvoyant, but because he owns the fastest intelligence network on the continent. Before kings even receive word of Napoleon's defeat, a Rothschild agent on horseback gallops across muddy borders, racing the truth back to Nathan. When the news reaches him, he doesn't rejoice. He doesn't panic. He executes. Nathan walks into the London Stock Exchange and sells everything. Panic spreads like wildfire. Investors believe Britain has lost. Markets plummet. And just when the chaos peaks, Rothschild steps back in, and buys it all back for pennies on the pound. When the official news of victory arrives, Nathan Rothschild owns a staggering portion of Britain's economy. It wasn't a crime. It was information. Weaponized. This is the moment when the Rothschilds stop being mere bankers and become architects of influence. They didn't win wars, they made wars winnable. They didn't topple governments, they made it too expensive for governments to stay in power unless they cooperated. And the world, unknowingly, started running on Rothschild credit. The public saw flags waving, empires shifting, monuments rising. But behind the spectacle, invisible hands adjusted interest rates, brokered truces, and rewrote fates. You were never taught this in school, because the people who write your history are paid by the people who own your future. The House of Rothschild didn't just bankroll armies, they engineered dependency. If a nation needed war, they provided the means. If a nation lost, they funded the reparations. Either way, the ledger always grew, in their favor. Think about that. They turned bloodshed into balance sheets. And what's more terrifying than a family whose power increases with every bomb dropped, every king dethroned, every child buried under rubble labeled progress? This is no longer history. It's a mirror. Because once you see how power really moves, you'll never look at your country, your freedom, or your choices the same way again. And this is only the beginning. That you've been told money rules the world. That's not quite true. Debt rules the world, and the Rothschilds mastered it before you were even born. They discovered the darkest secret of human ambition, that nations are addicted to credit, like opium for empires. Once hooked, they will never free themselves. When kings needed cannons, they borrowed. When governments needed railroads, they borrowed. When revolutions sparked, when colonies rebelled, when economies crashed, they all came crawling back to the same quiet halls, the ones lined with the Rothschild seal. And the genius? They never took sides. Why would they? War was just a marketplace with better margins. Whether the right won or the left prevailed, whether freedom rang or tyranny marched, it didn't matter. Because the Rothschilds understood something most men never grasp: control doesn't come from victory, it comes from necessity. And if a nation needs you to survive, you own it more than any flag or constitution ever could. That's how 5 brothers, scattered across Europe like seeds, built a hidden empire without thrones or armies. Frankfurt, Vienna, Paris, Naples, London, each one a capital, each one a fortress of finance. And behind each door, a calculation: how much blood is worth a bond? How much suffering can be translated into sovereign interest? Cold? Perhaps. But that's the language of real power. While the world bowed to monarchs and generals, the Rothschilds whispered into the ears of treasury ministers and kings. They didn't conquer cities, they conquered decisions. And when you conquer decisions, you control destinies. This isn't just about one family. It's about a blueprint, a system of engineered dependency. And today, that system still thrives, invisible to the average eye, embedded in the very currencies you trade, the taxes you pay, the inflation you're told is normal. But here's the question you must ask yourself: if a single family could bind entire empires to their will 200 years ago, who's binding your nation today? Think deeper. This isn't conspiracy, this is continuity. A shadow architecture of loyalty, leverage, and lies. Most will never see it. But if you've made it this far, maybe you were never meant to be most. Keep watching. The descent continues. There's a reason the history books never mention the pigeons. Not the statues, not the monuments, the pigeons. Trained, swift, loyal only to their masters. In the early 1800s, as armies marched and kings made declarations, the Rothschilds deployed their own messengers, flocks of birds carrying financial intelligence across borders faster than any rider, faster than any courier. While empires relied on horses and hope, the Rothschilds created a private information network, a silent weapon deadlier than any sword. Before nations even knew the outcome of a battle, the Rothschilds were already profiting from it. That's not myth. That's recorded, but never taught. Why? Because if you understood the value of time, if you saw how information in the right hands, a few hours early, could shift the fate of millions, you'd never again believe the lie of a fair system. On June 18, 1815, the fields of Waterloo turned red with blood. But in London, Nathan Rothschild waited, not with armies, but with nerves of steel. His pigeons brought him the news a full day before anyone else: Napoleon had lost. The empire had fallen. Britain had won. But Nathan? He stayed silent. For an entire day, he let the London stock market believe the British had been crushed. Panic set in. Prices plummeted. And when the floor was low enough, he bought everything. Bonds, stocks, power, all purchased at a discount only he could access. And when the official news finally reached the city, the market exploded. The Rothschild fortune tripled overnight. Think about that. A war fought over decades, decided not by generals, but by a man who waited. Who watched. Who understood that when you control information, you don't just predict the future, you own it. Today, we live in a world flooded with information. Tweets, newsflashes, breaking updates. But here's the trap: noise isn't knowledge. And while you scroll, there are still people building networks behind the curtain. Still forces gathering data not to inform you, but to maneuver around you. The Rothschilds didn't invent manipulation, but they perfected it. And the systems they engineered still whisper through the global economy like an old ghost. Can you feel it? That quiet unease? Good. That's the beginning of awareness. And we're only just getting started. There is a moment when a man realizes the world he lives in was built not for him, but around him. Constructed like a maze, where every turn feels like choice, but every wall was drawn by another hand. The Rothschilds didn't just build banks. They built systems. Frameworks. Invisible cages dressed in gold leaf and velvet words like prosperity, progress, and nation. After Waterloo, Nathan Rothschild wasn't merely rich, he was essential. Britain owed him. Governments owed him. And that's when the real empire began. Not one marked by borders and flags, but by debt. They say war is expensive. But what they don't say is who profits when countries bleed. It's not just about financing weapons or armies. It's about controlling the aftermath. Because the man who funds the rebuilding owns more than just interest payments, he owns policy, influence, submission. The Rothschilds became the lenders of last resort to Europe's great powers. France, Austria, Prussia, Britain, all indebted. And through that debt, came leverage. Monarchs bowed not just from custom, but from necessity. The family was granted titles, estates, immunity from taxes in some regions. Why? Because if they pulled their money, empires fell. And it didn't stop with Europe. The Rothschilds' influence stretched into the Ottoman Empire, Latin America, Egypt. They weren't colonizers in the traditional sense. They didn't need to fire a single shot. They colonized through credit. And here's the part they'll never teach you in school. The modern nation-state is not built on freedom, it is built on financing. Constitutions, revolutions, even civil wars, all become financial equations when you pull back far enough. And who do you think solves those equations? The Rothschilds created a world where kings could be dethroned, but creditors never questioned. Where elections changed faces, but debts remained eternal. Think your vote changes everything? Then ask yourself, when was the last time your country wasn't in debt? And to whom? You're not living in a democracy. You're living in a managed debt ecosystem. And every system has its architects. You were taught to chase freedom. But real power is never advertised. It's quiet. Cold. And it wears the face of the banker more often than the general. There's a reason the deepest truths are never whispered in history classes, because they don't belong to the victors. They belong to the engineers of victory. The Rothschilds understood something almost no one else did, that narratives shape empires as much as armies. And so they never sought the spotlight, they funded it. They didn't crave fame. They craved invisibility. Because the most powerful man in any room is the one no one notices, but whom everyone depends on. By the mid-1800s, the Rothschilds had become Europe's silent sovereigns. They controlled not only wealth, but access to credit, to information, to influence. When revolutions erupted across Europe in 1848, the common man thought it was about liberty. But behind every upheaval were financial tremors. As thrones crumbled and republics rose, debts remained. The House of Rothschild didn't lose power, they diversified it. And while crowds cheered in the streets, the family moved quietly in boardrooms, brokered loans to new regimes, and ensured that whoever held the crown owed them interest. Every change was another opportunity. They mastered the art of funding both sides, hedging bets not on ideology, but on inevitability. While flags changed, their influence only grew. Now pause, and think about that. What does it mean to profit no matter who wins? It means the true game isn't played on battlefields. It's played in backrooms, over ledgers, in whispers between elites. You were taught to think in terms of nations. But the Rothschilds were thinking in terms of systems. They weren't loyal to any king or constitution. Their allegiance was to structure, a structure of control rooted in capital and compounded in silence. And this structure didn't just shape Europe. It designed modern capitalism. Stock exchanges, central banks, corporate law, all these tools we now take for granted were once sharpened at Rothschild desks. The world's wealthiest family became its quietest institution. A hidden empire, where each generation was raised not with dreams, but with directives. And while the public stared at parliaments and presidents, the Rothschilds stared at bonds, markets, and governments like chessboards. If history feels scripted, it's because someone wrote it. And you were never invited to read the original draft. Until now. If you want to understand real power, don't look at who speaks the loudest, look at who speaks last. After the 1848 revolutions and a century of war financing, the Rothschilds had learned how to stay behind the curtain and still pull every string. But their power didn't stop with money. No. They began to manipulate something far more dangerous: information. Before telegrams, before Wall Street tickers, before modern media, they built a communication network that outpaced governments. Couriers, coded letters, carrier pigeons, even ships under false flags, all dedicated to delivering truth faster than any ruler could react. By the time a king heard of a treaty or a battle, the Rothschilds had already placed bets on the outcome. Their agents moved silently through capitals, carrying news not to inform, but to position. And it wasn't just about news. It was about shaping perception. During the Battle of Waterloo, legend tells of Nathan Rothschild standing at the London Stock Exchange, already knowing Napoleon had lost. While the city waited for confirmation, he began to sell. Panic set in. Others sold. Prices collapsed. Then, when the market was at its lowest, he bought everything. By the time news of victory arrived, he owned vast shares of British industry, purchased at a discount created by fear. True or not, this story reveals a deeper truth: whoever controls fear, controls the future. The Rothschilds didn't just manipulate markets. They engineered belief systems. They understood that power is not in money itself, but in what people believe it represents. Security. Hope. Survival. So they injected themselves into every institution that framed that belief: central banks, treasury departments, economic councils. And over time, nations stopped asking, "Can we afford this?" and started asking, "Will the Rothschilds fund this?" The rulers changed. The regimes fell. But one name always stayed on the signatures of debt. And while the world called it progress, the Rothschilds called it positioning. The deeper you descend into their story, the more you realize, this isn't about wealth. It's about conditioning. Conditioning generations to need the very hands that bind them. And the scariest part? It worked. You were born into a world they helped construct. You trade, invest, pay taxes, and vote, inside a system they helped design. And only now are you beginning to see the blueprint. Keep going. You're not supposed to. Which is exactly why you must. They say the pen is mightier than the sword, but what happens when one family controls both? As Europe marched into the age of empires and industry, the Rothschilds mastered a new form of conquest, not through bloodshed, but through binding contracts. Armies fight wars, but bankers decide when they start, and how long they last. And nobody financed both sides of history's deadliest conflicts with such precision as the House of Rothschild. When Prussia needed weapons, they funded the steel. When France needed railroads, they bankrolled the tracks. When nations bled, the Rothschilds sold them bandages, and charged interest. But the truth goes deeper. You see, the Rothschilds didn't just support wars. They designed the financial mechanisms that require wars to justify their own existence. Central banks. National debts. Military budgets built not for peace, but for perpetual readiness. Governments became addicted to borrowing, just to survive the machinery they themselves set in motion. And through every war bond, every restructuring, every emergency bailout, the Rothschilds weren't just funding conflict. They were shaping control. Because what does a government do when it owes you more than it can repay? It obeys. This is the real secret of empire. It's not about ruling land. It's about ruling leverage. And leverage lives in fear. Fear of collapse. Fear of invasion. Fear of running out of gold. When the Panic of 1893 brought the U.S. to its knees, it wasn't a president or general who saved the country, it was J.P. Morgan, backed by the Rothschilds, quietly wiring millions in gold to stop the economy from imploding. A private citizen propping up a sovereign state. That's not just influence. That's dominion. But why would they do it? Why would the Rothschilds save a country like the U.S., far from European power centers? Because they knew the future. Europe's empires were burning out. America was the next throne to sit upon. Not with troops. Not with flags. But with credit. They bet on the next empire, and made sure they held the deed. You're starting to see it now, aren't you? This isn't a conspiracy. It's an architecture. A hidden lattice of power beneath the illusion of democracy and freedom. And for the first time, you're not looking up at the structure. You're walking inside it. Welcome to the part they never wanted you to find. Keep moving. The descent has only just begun. That you've heard of kings, presidents, and revolutions. But none of them, ruled the world like the men who controlled currency flow. What if I told you that while nations debated ideology, behind closed doors, the only real language spoken was debt, and the only true ruler was whoever could sell it? The Rothschilds didn't just lend money, they engineered national dependence. Every treaty, every infrastructure project, every bailout, tied to a paper trail they controlled. And it wasn't just in Europe. By the early 20th century, their shadow stretched into the arteries of American finance. And yet, they kept silent. That was their power. See, true domination doesn't look like tyranny. It looks like help. A friendly loan here. A rescue package there. But every dollar came with strings, invisible ones. And slowly, without a shot being fired, sovereign nations surrendered their will. How do you enslave an empire? Not with chains. With interest rates. But the House of Rothschild was never alone. Other families watched, learned, and rose. The House of Morgan. The Rockefellers. But none of them had the web of blood loyalty the Rothschilds had. That was the secret, unity. While other empires fractured from within, the Rothschild sons, stationed in Paris, Vienna, Naples, Frankfurt, and London, operated like a living organism. One mind. One agenda. Decentralized power with centralized command. When one country fell into turmoil, another branch picked up the slack. When one son died, another replaced him. Governments rose and fell. The Rothschilds endured. Even the Vatican turned to them in times of crisis. Yes, the church that once demonized their bloodline now begged for their gold. That's not irony. That's supremacy. And all the while, the public never saw the full picture. That's how they wanted it. Public attention is a liability. Mystery is a fortress. The less you know about who owns your currency, the easier it is to convince you you're free. But ask yourself this: why is it that in nearly every major global conflict, from Napoleonic wars to world wars, the trail of money always winds back to the same names? Why is their history never taught? Their influence never questioned? Because the deeper you dig, the more uncomfortable the truth becomes. You weren't raised to see power this way. But now, you can't unsee it. Keep going. What comes next will change how you view every government, every war, and every dollar in your pocket. They say history is written by the victors, but what if the victors were never on the battlefield? What if they wore no armor, held no rifles, yet bent empires with the stroke of a pen? As the 20th century dawned, the Rothschild Empire was no longer just a family business, it had become a transnational entity. Through carefully orchestrated financial entanglements, they embedded themselves into the DNA of Western civilization. Central banks were their playgrounds. Wars were investment opportunities. And alliances? Merely strategic partnerships in a global chessboard of debt and influence. But the game was evolving. New players entered the arena, like J.P. Morgan and the Rockefellers. Yet, none matched the Rothschilds in one key domain: silence. While others craved headlines, the Rothschilds preferred whispers. They knew power was more potent when unseen. In 1913, a quiet but monumental event reshaped global finance forever: the creation of the U.S. Federal Reserve. A private central bank with the power to print America's money. The public was told it would stabilize the economy. But few realized that private interests, connected through banking dynasties, would now control the very lifeblood of the nation. The fingerprints of old European families, hidden, but unmistakable, were all over it. Currency would no longer be tied to something real, like gold. It would be tied to trust. And who controlled that trust? Not the people. Not the presidents. But men who never needed to be elected, never needed to campaign, never even needed to be known. This was the final transformation, from merchant to monarch. From financiers to gods of global value. Every dollar printed, every interest rate shift, every recession, they all served a deeper rhythm, one you were never meant to hear. But now, you're beginning to feel it, aren't you? The slow tightening of a system built not for your freedom, but for your obedience. The Rothschilds didn't just profit off the world, they designed the very rules it follows. And as you sit here, watching this, you might be wondering, how deep does it go? Good. That means you're waking up. Now, before we descend further, I want you to comment below: the veil is lifting. Write it twice. Once for the self you're shedding, and once for the self you're becoming. Because the next sections, they reveal what happens when the world's richest family faces collapse, and how they turn disaster into domination. Keep watching. This is the part they pray you never hear: collapse. That was the word whispered through mahogany boardrooms and candlelit halls in the early 20th century. The world was burning. The assassination of a single archduke triggered a war that would drown Europe in blood. But while men died in trenches, families like the Rothschild stayed dry, because they had long since positioned themselves above the nations, above the borders. Yet something was shifting. For the first time, even the Rothschilds couldn't stop what was coming. World War I wasn't just a conflict, it was a reckoning. The empires they had once funded, the Austrians, the Russians, even the British, began to crack. Their carefully cultivated networks, from Paris to Vienna, were torn apart by revolution and rising anti-Semitism. And for the first time in over a century, a new kind of danger crept close, not from financial rivals, but from mobs and ideologies that no banker could bribe or control. Still, they adapted. They always do. While public hatred surged, the Rothschilds pivoted from overt dominance to covert resilience. They leveraged their gold reserves, their government bonds, their intelligence networks, not to win battles, but to survive them. In London, the family's nerve center, they backed the British war effort, helping raise vast sums through war bonds. In Paris, they financed railroads to move troops and munitions. And in Austria, even as chaos loomed, they tried to hold the center. But the world no longer followed the same script. By 1917, revolutions erupted in Russia, and the Tsar, once a client of Rothschild lending, was executed. Decades of carefully woven influence were shredded overnight, yet here lies the secret most never grasp: true power is not measured by control, but by adaptation. The Rothschilds didn't collapse. They evolved. They became quieter, more elusive, shifting their empire from public-facing banking into private capital, strategic assets, and elite partnerships. No longer the kings of currency, they became the architects of silence. And this transformation ensured they would never be easy targets again. Because now, you couldn't strike what you couldn't see. This wasn't the end of an empire, it was its rebirth. A darker, subtler version that would now shape the century in ways even governments couldn't predict. And as the dust of war settled, the world didn't realize it had just handed even more power to the shadows. The real question is, what did they do next? Stay close. What you're about to discover in the next section is where finance turns into weapon, and trust becomes the ultimate illusion. They say wars are fought with bullets, but that's not true. Wars are fought with money, silent, invisible, flowing like blood beneath the battlefield. And after World War I, the Rothschilds understood this better than anyone. While nations lay in ruin, with broken economies and grieving citizens, the House of Rothschild began financing the rebuilding, on both sides. Reparations had to be paid. Debts needed collecting. Infrastructure had to be rebuilt. And every one of those needs required capital. Their capital. Quietly, they reinserted themselves into the financial arteries of Europe, offering lifelines to crumbling governments. But make no mistake, nothing was given freely. Every loan meant leverage. Every bond meant control. While the world begged for stability, they negotiated influence behind the scenes, writing the next chapter of Europe in ledgers, not treaties, but a darker shadow was rising. Inflation in Germany reached apocalyptic levels, wheelbarrows of cash for a loaf of bread. Nationalism was boiling. And with it came a renewed hatred of bankers, especially Jewish ones. The Rothschild name, once synonymous with power, was now painted on the walls in venomous graffiti. In Vienna and Berlin, their branches were under siege, not by competitors, but by ideologies. The Nazis didn't just want political control, they wanted to purge the old financial order. And the Rothschilds were its symbol. In the years leading up to World War II, their assets were frozen. Their family members were hunted. Art, property, estates, all seized under the illusion of national purification. It was one of the most calculated financial purges in modern history, and yet, they survived. Again. Because they had already evolved beyond being just a European banking dynasty. Their gold wasn't all in vaults anymore, it was buried in trusts, diversified in Swiss shells, invested through American fronts. When Hitler's tanks rolled into Paris, many Rothschilds were already on ships to London, to New York. They knew what was coming. They always know. And when the dust of that Second World War settled, who do you think was there, once again, financing the rebuild? Who had the gold reserves to supply the Allies, the political reach to influence the Marshall Plan, the networks to profit from the chaos? The answer isn't on the surface. It never is. But the deeper you go, the clearer it becomes. The true empire doesn't need territory. It owns decisions. It rents governments. And it survives every war by making sure both sides lose just enough to need them. Now listen carefully. In the next chapter, we uncover how this empire moved beyond Europe entirely, and how it reshaped the destiny of the most powerful country on Earth. Keep going. You're not just watching. You're remembering. The world began to shift. As the 19th century closed, cracks formed in the old world order. Nationalism grew louder, alliances tangled into invisible snares, and somewhere deep in the halls of empire, war drums began to echo again. But the Rothschilds didn't flinch, they moved capital like generals move troops. In London, in Paris, in Vienna, they financed railways, mines, governments, revolutions. Their names were whispered in gilded corridors and backroom parlors alike. When France lost the war in 1871, reparations poured into German hands. But it wasn't kings who carried the weight of gold, it was bankers. Rothschild bankers. They were the quiet custodians of nations. And yet, power attracts rot. By the dawn of the 20th century, the House of Morgan in America began rising fast, propelled by industrial war chests and the expanding American empire. And where power shifts, old titans must either adapt or be forgotten. The Rothschilds, still vast and global, began to sense something, like a shadow passing over the old world. War was coming again. Bigger. Bloodier. The kind that changes everything. It began with a bullet in Sarajevo. But it was never just about Franz Ferdinand. That trigger pulled centuries of hate, pride, and deals into the light. And as Europe burned, Rothschild money moved in every direction. But for the first time, the family was split. Their banks supported different sides. One Rothschild's war bonds were another Rothschild's burden. The ancient family unity that once protected their empire now cracked under the strain of nationalism. Trains full of soldiers were funded by bonds the Rothschilds helped float. Bullets were purchased with money they had arranged. But in war, even kingmakers can bleed. As trench warfare ground men into dust, entire economies crumbled. And in America, the House of Morgan stepped forward. They funded the U.S. war effort, issued Liberty bonds, and loaned billions to the Allies. While the Rothschilds still held enormous influence, something had changed. The center of global finance was shifting west. London was dimming. New York was glowing. And the quiet war between banking empires had just begun. After the war, Europe was never the same. The Rothschilds, though still powerful, were fractured. In Germany, France, Austria, they were bankers in countries that now hated each other. Worse, anti-Semitic conspiracies took root in the ashes of defeat. The Rothschild name, long synonymous with influence, became a target. In whispered corners, people didn't see them as financiers, they saw puppeteers. Lies, half-truths, and centuries-old envy wove into dangerous narratives. But the Rothschilds didn't respond with outrage. They responded with silence. With strategy. They diversified. Spread assets. Funded cultural institutions. Stayed in the shadows. In America, Jack Morgan took the spotlight, helping shape post-war recovery and locking the Morgan name into the mythology of American capitalism. Meanwhile, the Rothschilds stayed old world. Aristocratic. Controlled. But control was slipping. Nations were falling into chaos. Germany's economy was in ruins. And when desperation grows, monsters emerge from the dark. In 1933, a man with a mustache and a bitter heart rose to power in Germany. His voice cracked through radios like a curse. And behind every evil speech, behind every paranoid decree, there was a target: Jews. International bankers. The Rothschilds. Hitler didn't just want conquest, he wanted vengeance on history. And to him, the Rothschilds embodied it all. In Vienna, in Paris, in Berlin, their branches were seized. Art, homes, entire financial networks vanished overnight. Some family members fled. Some were caught. The empire they had built over centuries was collapsing in months. It was a test of endurance unlike anything they had faced. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about survival. Still, fragments of the family resisted. Helped resistance movements. Funded exile governments. But make no mistake, World War II was the end of the Rothschild dynasty as it had once been. The empires were falling, and this time, even the shadows weren't safe. After the war, Europe was rubble. But out of that rubble, something new began to rise: the American century. The dollar replaced the pound. Wall Street became the new Olympus. And the Rothschilds, those survivors of kingdoms, revolutions, and extermination attempts, had a choice: fade or evolve. In London, N.M. Rothschild and Sons became more discreet, more exclusive. No longer an empire, but a sanctuary of influence. They stopped chasing headlines. They funded discrete projects. They advised governments quietly. They became myth and rumor again. Meanwhile, the banking world exploded. Mergers. Mega deals. High-speed trading. Offshore accounts. A new game, faster, colder, more ruthless. And yet, in the midst of all this noise, the Rothschilds played a different game. Legacy over spectacle. Secrecy over exposure. It wasn't about being richest anymore. It was about surviving history itself. Again. By the 1980s, the world had changed again. Information became currency. Leverage became a weapon. And public scandals started to pierce the elite's armor. In this era, the Rothschilds found themselves entangled with one of Britain's most enigmatic moguls, Robert Maxwell. A man hungry for wealth and haunted by trauma. The Rothschilds helped fund his rise. But as his empire cracked, so did reputations. Maxwell disappeared, mysteriously lost at sea. Billions were missing. Pension funds were gutted. And although the Rothschilds weren't directly blamed, they were no longer invisible. Cameras were everywhere now. Secrets harder to keep. And yet, they didn't break. Sir Evelyn Rothschild reasserted control, tightened privacy, pulled back from the spectacle. In the age of cameras, he chose shadows. Always the same lesson: survive the storm, and wait for history to forget. Now the world belongs to algorithms. Power is no longer just held by men in suits, but in code, in invisible systems, in data too vast to trace. But still, names like Rothschild echo in conspiracy, in myth, in the undercurrent of paranoia that never dies. Because people fear what they can't touch. And the Rothschilds have always been just out of reach. In 2023, the family exists in fragments: wealth management, private equity, global advisory. Not an empire. A legacy. And that legacy no longer needs the spotlight. Because true power doesn't scream. It whispers. And the Rothschilds? They've mastered the whisper. This isn't about being worshipped. It's about being unkillable. And while the world obsesses over the loud, the Rothschilds remain silent, and enduring. That if you've made it this far, you already know. This wasn't just a history lesson. This was an unveiling. Of how the world moves. Of how real power behaves. It doesn't announce itself. It weaves. It waits. It survives revolutions, wars, collapses, and digital transformations. The story of the Rothschilds is the story of control, quiet, generational, and cold-blooded. But it's also a warning. Because now you know how legacy is built. How institutions enslave minds. How hidden hands shape the fate of nations. This isn't about envy. This is about awakening. Because once you see the strings, you can never unsee them. Now, I want you to comment below this video. I see the invisible architecture. I see the invisible architecture. Say it twice, because you're not the same person you were when this video started. And the algorithm? It remembers the ones who wake up.